Hey peeps, welcome to another video. Today it is part 3 of the McCalls 7537 sew along. Today we are going to be covering putting in the midriff panels, be making the skirt, adding the trim to the bottom and the tiered section of the skirt, attaching it to the bodice and sewing in the side zip. So let's get started. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to start working on the midriff, and we're not doing the one with the gathers on it, so I'll find the right bit and show you those instructions. The pattern actually does direct you when you get to that bit. It says, oh here we go, it says midriff. Prepare and stitch midriff sections into bodice in the same manner as midriff. So we're just going to ignore all the bits for the gathered pieces, and then we are going to start at step 15. So we need to stitch midriff sections together at right side, leaving left side open as shown. So we're going to get that done for both the outer and the lining, and then there won't be the gathering on it. Going to get the sides sewn together on both the outer and lining midriff pieces. What the pattern wants you to do is with right side together, pin midriff to lower edge of bodice, matching centres and symbols, adjust gathers and baste. But I'm actually, because it's me, I'm going to do something a bit different. Rather than put the binding across the middle of my midriff section, I'm actually going to bind the top and the bottom because I like the way that it's looked doing the seam allowance on the bodice, and also because I have just adjusted the pattern to be at length in here. I didn't then adjust where the midriff piece would be for me to accurately mark where this needs to go, so it's kind of me being lazy. So what I've done is I've put the lining and the outer together, wrong sides together, and pinned across the top, matching up the centre, or the side seam here. It's not the centre back, it's the side seam. And then I've got the marks on here where the gathers need to be taken down to, and I'm going to pin it so that it's wrong sides together, so that I end up with the seam allowance on the outside. I'm going to actually reduce the seam allowance I'm using for this as well, because I have noticed that the top of this is probably going to be a little bit short for me. I think I need to, in the future with dresses like this, rather than add length to the midriff, which is where the pattern actually directs you to, I need to add length to the bodice part of it. I'm going to carry on and persevere with this dress because I think it's going to work, and if it doesn't, it's not the end of the world. I can definitely either turn this into a skirt, or I have enough of this fabric left that I could take the bodice off and recut that. I'm going to attach this one, try it on and see if I need to do that now or if I'm going to be happy with the dress. So what I'm going to do is, like I say, I'm going to pin this wrong sides together with the bodice, adjust the gathers so that they fit in within the marks that we've made, and then sew this on. This has worked really well as well, which is good. So I'm just going to, I've pressed this seam down so all the seam allowance is going towards the midriff sections. Then the interior looks like this. I've removed my basting stitches, so I'm going to pin this into place, and then I'm going to do the same thing with this that I did with this. I'm going to top stitch this side down first and then this side, just so that it looks nice and neat and even, and I think that's going to look really cool. And I'm going to do the same for the bottom half when I attach it to the skirt, which will be the next process, so that I can then finish the side seams. I'm loving how this is turning out, and I've tried it on and it actually isn't too long in, it wasn't too short here for me. I'm still not 100% sure if I'm going to add the eyelets along here and then put a string in. I have a feeling that I might need to, because I think it may be a little bit cleavage-tastic without them, but I'm gonna leave that right till the last minute, and if it does need them in, that's very easy to add in, and then I can also make myself a strip of this stuff to work as the tie, unless I buy some cording, because that's a possibility as well. But yeah, I'm really pleased with how this is coming out, so that's good. Sleeves are next on the pattern, but I'm not going to put the sleeves in until I've put the skirt on, because as I mentioned earlier, I'm leaving these sides open so that I can use bias binding to finish the raw edges. I need to have the skirt on to do that, and the sleeves can't go in yet. So next thing we're going to do is we are going to work on the skirt front and back. They want us to stitch those together at the sides, but I'm only going to do that on one side, obviously, because again I need to be adding bias binding to that. And then there is the hem band. So I'm going to do the same thing that I've been doing with this bias binding, and I'm going to use that to decorate and hide my hem so that the inside of this dress is completely clean finished. I'm really liking how this is turning out. So I'm going to stitch one side of my skirt section together. There isn't a front and a back, so it doesn't matter which one, as long as I obviously attach it to the right, to this bit, the clothes seam, and I will be stitching that side seam with a French seam. Okay, so I'm going to sew the side seam next, and you guessed it, it's going to be a French seam. So I have the wrong sides together, and I'm going to sew it at 1/4 of an inch, trim it in half, and then press, turn, press, and sew it at 3/8 of an inch, as I have done with all the other French seams. And if you would like to have a look at a tutorial for French seams, you can find a link to basic French seams here, I hope. Otherwise it's over there, but I think it's here. Again, I have sewn my seam at 1/4 of an inch. I've trimmed it down in half. This is actually the bottom band, and that's the skirt. I've done the same for both. So I'm now going to press them with the right sides together so that I can then finish this off by sewing a seam of 3/8 of an inch. I'm then going to press one of the seams towards the front and one of the seams towards the back so I can nest them together, and then I'll be sewing them together in the same manner so that I can use bias binding to finish off the edge. Okay, so I finished my French seams, and as I said, I have pressed one way and one the other way so that I can nest them together. And this is the bottom band and the skirt, and I've pinned them together all the way along, and I'm going to sew them again with my bias binding, and I am going to use this as my seam allowance rather than 5/8 of an inch. Again, I am quite tall, so any extra length that I can add to any pieces of this skirt are going to be good. I'm going to match up the raw edges and sew in this stitch here, and once I've done that, I'm going to press everything, and then I can top stitch it like I have been for the rest of the skirt. So I'm going to get that done next. Okay, so I have the skirt band attached to the skirt, and I'm now going to top stitch down the bias binding. And again, I have got a nice clean finish on the inside, and I'm going to top stitch this edge, and I'm going to top stitch this edge for decoration and to make everything look cohesive. So I'm going to get that done, and then we can start gathering up the top edge of the skirt so it will fit on our bodice. I have finished the bias binding off on the skirt, so I have just run 2 lines of gathering stitches, the same as I did for the bodice. One's 3/8 of an inch down, and then the other is another 3/8 of an inch down, so there's the actual seam lines in here. Although I may do the same thing and actually sew the seam allowance on with that as my seam allowance rather than 5/8 of an inch. In fact, I think I'm probably going to, but this still worked nicely for the previous gathers, so I've done the same thing. So I'm going to match up the side seams, I'm going to match up the notches, and then I'm going to pull the gathering stitches down so that the skirt goes onto the bodice. I have matched up all my notches. I have gathered my skirt down to fit into the waistband, and I'm sewing it with the bias binding. You want to sew this with the gathered side up so that you can make sure that the pleats are behaving themselves and are nicely arranged, and that's going to be the same whether you're using bias binding or not. For me, I've pinned them wrong sides together, so this is the outside of the bodice, this is the outside of the skirt, and I'm going to close and finish off all the raw edges with the seam binding or with the bias binding like I have done with the rest of the dress. Get this seam finished and then get this pressed and top stitched down. So it's starting to look a bit like a dress. I have top stitched down this bias binding. I sewed it on so that the bias binding would be top stitched to the bodice, to the midriff, sorry, and I did the same with this one, so it got flipped into the midriff. So the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to bind both of these edges with bias binding so that this edge is finished, and then I can install the invisible zip. Now, as you guys know, I am not a huge fan of side zips, but there is gathering in the middle here and obviously the midriff bands as well, and I decided that I was going to give it a try for this one, so fingers crossed it behaves itself. Okay, so I have just installed the invisible zip. It's not actually what the pattern calls for. The pattern calls for a dress zip that you then center and sew down, but I don't particularly like doing that, so I have decided to go for an invisible zip. And my tip for that is sew in one side of the invisible zip, zip it closed, and then mark the points that you need to match. So I think you can see here I have the 2 lines for the bias binding from the other side so that I know where I needed to aim those for, and then I've basted the zip in and I have anchored those match points really securely so that they don't move around, and then I've sewn the zip in and it's worked really well. So the next thing we need to do is close up the top of the underarm seam, and I haven't done that previously because I wanted to use an invisible zip, not a regular dress zip. So that's the next thing I'm going to do, and we're going to do that the same way as we're going to close up the bottom with our regular zipper foot, and I'll show you what I mean when I get there. I haven't pressed it yet, but I have finished the top of this seam, and as you can see the zip is nice and invisible. So I'm going to show you how I did that. I have my regular zipper foot on, I have my needle moved as far over to the right as it can go, and what I've done is the same thing that I'm going to do when I'm finishing off the bottom of this seam. I have overlapped, so these are the zipper stitches here, let's see, these ones back there, and then this is finishing up the side seam. So I've overlapped those by about 3/8 of an inch, and I've gotten them as close as I can without actually touching them. So I've backstitched there, and I've just sewn at 5/8 of an inch and backstitched at the top. So I'm going to do exactly the same for the bottom of the zip. I'm going to pin that all together, overlap the bottom of the stitching that installs the zip, sew as close as I can, which will probably be 1/8 of an inch away, and then sew to the hem so that the side seam will be finished. Side seam is sewn up, which means I can now finish the hem. I'm going to use bias binding on the hem, and I'm going to sew it in such a way that it's going to turn out, and this is going to be what you see. I'm going to get that done next. So for the effect that I want, I'm sewing the right side of the binding to the wrong side of the skirt along this crease here, and then I'm going to flip it around, press it, and then top stitch it. So when I started my bias binding, I folded over 3/4 of an inch and top stitched that down, and now that I'm coming to the end, I'm going to overlap by the same amount again, and that will give me a nice clean finish on the other side when I flip it over. Any questions at all, please let me know in the comments section down below, and I will do my best to answer them for you. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!